It started like any other morning. The sun was just beginning to rise over my farm, casting long shadows across the fields I had worked my entire life to protect. But as I walked out to check the cattle, the sound of heavy machinery, something I never thought I'd hear on my land, cut through the peaceful silence. My heart stopped. Bulldozers were tearing up the soil of my family's farm, and I had no idea who had the audacity to trespass this far. What I didn't know was that this wasn't just an innocent mistake. This was a battle that would take me to the very heart of corruption, greed, and betrayal, where I would learn that some people will stop at nothing to steal what isn't theirs. And what I did next would change everything, not just for me, but for every landowner in the county. It was early one morning, the kind of morning that made you feel like nothing could disturb the peace. The rooster crowed, signaling that the day was starting. Birds were chirping, the sky a faint pink hue as the sun began to rise. For Thomas Johnson, a quiet, hard-working farmer, this was a routine he knew by heart. For the past 30 years, this land had been his responsibility, a 100-acre farm passed down from his grandfather, who had built the homestead with his own 2 hands. Every corner of the farm held memories, from a barn where his father had once taught him how to mend fences to the fields where his children played. But this morning would be different. He was in the barn, preparing feed for the cattle, when the distant sound of a bulldozer reached his ears. At first, he thought it was just the wind carrying the noise from another farm. But as the sound grew louder, his gut twisted with unease. He rushed outside, his boots slapping against the dirt as he made his way toward the sound. When he reached the edge of the driveway, his worst fears were confirmed. A bulldozer was tearing up his land. 2 men in yellow vests were working, clearly oblivious of the man whose livelihood was being destroyed right before his eyes. Thomas shouted, his voice raw with anger. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" He felt the rush of adrenaline, the same feeling he got when facing a storm, when everything seemed to come crashing down at once. The foreman barely looked up from his clipboard. "We're building a bus stop for the HOA," he said, as if that explained everything. "On my land." Thomas was shaking now, his heart pounding. The foreman just shrugged, handing him a piece of paper that was supposed to be the approval for the project. But it didn't matter. Nothing in that document gave him the right to destroy what had been in his family for generations. This wasn't just about property. It was about his heritage, his history. "Pack up your things." Now, Thomas demanded. He wasn't about to let them get away with it. But the foreman didn't back down. "We'll be back tomorrow," he warned, a smug smirk playing on his lips. "We've got the papers now. This is happening." And just like that, the fight began. Thomas Johnson wasn't just a farmer. He was a guardian of his family's legacy. His grandfather, a man of grit and determination, had built this farm from nothing. The old farmhouse, the barn, and the fields were all reminders of what it took to create something enduring. Over the years, Thomas had watched his family pour sweat and blood into this land, raising livestock and crops, and doing everything by their own sweat and hands. His father had instilled in him the values of hard work, independence, and most importantly, respect for the land. When Thomas woke up that morning, he had no idea that everything he knew and loved would be threatened. The bulldozer was the first sign, but it wasn't the only one. As he stood there, staring at the machinery carving up the soil that had fed his family for generations, a sinking feeling hit him. He knew the land better than anyone else, and this was his fight. The stakes were high. If the HOA succeeded in taking over his property, they could do anything next. They could strip away his land's integrity. They could put up bus stops, or worse, build developments without any respect for the history, the people, or the land that had been there long before them. The farm was Thomas's pride and joy, but it was also his responsibility. If he didn't step up now, who would? The younger generation might not have the same fire for land preservation, and his family's farm would be gone. Not just the soil and fences, but the memories, the history. It would all be erased, replaced by asphalt and concrete. He thought about his children. Would they even recognize this place if the HOA had its way? This wasn't just about stopping a bus stop. It was about protecting everything his family had worked for. It was about fighting for a future where the past could still be remembered. That night, as the sun set over the wreckage of his land, Thomas sat down at his kitchen table, staring at the paperwork the foreman had handed him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so he pulled out the county maps and began to dig deeper. As a senior zoning inspector for the county, Thomas had access to records that most people couldn't get their hands on. What he found wasn't just an oversight. It was a pattern. The HOA had a history of pushing boundaries, and not in a figurative sense. They were encroaching on land, fabricating easements, and bulldozing anything in their way to expand their control. But it wasn't just his land. No. The more he dug, the more he uncovered a disturbing truth. The HOA had done this before, quietly buying up properties and forcing others to sell through underhanded tactics. His land was just the next target in a long line of abuse. The deeper he dug, the more furious he became. He found evidence of fabricated boundary lines, discrepancies in the county's records, and even hints of corruption within the HOA itself. The HOA president, Richard Kessler, was a former real estate developer who had failed in the market crash years ago, but had found a new way to make money by leveraging his position in the HOA. It was all becoming clear now. The bus stop wasn't about safety, it was about money. As Thomas pieced together the truth, he realized this wasn't just an attack on his farm. It was an attack on the community. If he didn't act, if no one did, this kind of corruption would spread, and no one's land would be safe. It wasn't just a property at risk. It was the future of everyone who believed their land would always be theirs. The next morning, Thomas stood his ground. His legs were stiff with determination as he approached the construction site again. The workers, already setting up their equipment, looked up at him with a mixture of indifference and confusion. This time, he wasn't going to back down. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice low but firm. The workers looked at each other, hesitant. But it didn't take long for the foreman to emerge from his truck, holding that same smug attitude. "We've got the proper permits now. We're building this bus stop," the foreman said, waving his clipboard in front of Thomas's face, as if that was the end of the discussion. But Thomas wasn't done. "You don't have permission to build on my land," he countered. His voice was steady, but his heart raced with the knowledge that this was only going to get harder. The foreman shrugged, clearly uninterested in the legalities. "We're just doing our job," he muttered. It didn't matter. Thomas wasn't here to be polite. This was personal. He called the sheriff, his voice tight with anger. The workers left for the day, but Thomas knew this wasn't the end. The HOA had resources. They'd come back stronger. But he wasn't about to let them push him around by the time the next day rolled around. Thomas was exhausted from the stress, but he wasn't ready to give up. When a sleek, black SUV pulled up to his farm, he knew the confrontation wasn't over. A woman stepped out, looking every bit the part a corporate agent sent to handle business. Her professional attire was stark against the backdrop of the farm. She introduced herself as Melissa Vaughn, the Community Relations Director for Oakridge Estates. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to discuss the bus stop," she began, with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thomas wiped his hands on his overalls and looked her straight in the eye. "I know why you're here. You're trying to take my land." Her smile faltered for a second before she recovered. "It's not about land. It's about community. The safety of our children has to come first." Thomas didn't flinch. "This isn't about safety. This is about you trying to push me off my land to avoid spending money on a road expansion. Your so-called community improvement project is just a way to line your pockets." Her face hardened, but she continued. "I don't think you understand the stakes here. If you don't cooperate, we have other ways of handling this. The county can exercise eminent domain. We can take what we need for the public good." The words hit Thomas like a slap in the face. Threats. He could see right through them now, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. "Go ahead," he said calmly, meeting her gaze. "But you'll have an answer for every lie, every violation you committed. I'm not going anywhere." The conversation ended with the same thinly veiled threats, but Thomas had learned something vital. This wasn't just about power or land. It was about control. And he wasn't going to let them control him. That night, as Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the day pressed heavily on him. The sun had set, and the farm was silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. He stared at the documents in front of him, the ones he had painstakingly retrieved from the county records. As a county zoning inspector for 15 years, he had the ability to access files that others couldn't, and what he discovered in those files sent a chill down his spine. He had always known the HOA was powerful, but he hadn't realized just how deep their influence ran. The more Thomas read, the more disgusted he became. Oakridge Estates, the subdivision next to his farm, wasn't just an ordinary development. It was a tool used by the HOA president, Richard Kessler, to expand his wealth. Kessler, once a failed real estate developer, had found a new avenue to get rich through the HOA. The land he'd been encroaching on wasn't just any property. It was the heart of his family's farm, but it was also the key to unlocking millions in development potential for Kessler and his cronies. Through Thomas's investigation, he unearthed a disturbing history. The HOA had systematically bullied landowners into submission. They'd tried to take over properties through fake easements, false surveys, and even threats of legal action. This wasn't just about a bus stop anymore. This was about a ruthless, underhanded plan to gain control over valuable land without regard for the law or the people who lived there. Thomas's mind raced. The HOA had pushed through similar shady projects in the past. He discovered that Kessler had used his power as HOA president to pressure elderly homeowners into selling their land for pennies on the dollar, coercing them into signing contracts that were anything but fair. 2 neighbors had even lost their homes under suspicious circumstances, and Kessler's business connections were not so coincidentally involved in these deals. But now, it wasn't just about stealing land. It was about making a fortune off of the entire community. His blood boiled with anger. The betrayal stung deeper than he expected. He had to stop them before they got away with it again. He knew this fight wasn't just for him, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. The lessons were clear. Greed knew no boundaries, and corruption could spread like a virus if left unchecked. But what Thomas had now were the tools to fight back. He had the truth. For days, Thomas struggled to sleep. Every night, the same questions haunted his mind. Was it worth it? Should I just give in? The pressure weighed on him, pulling at his resolve. The quiet hum of the farm no longer felt peaceful. Instead, it felt suffocating. He had always been a man who took pride in his work, in his independence. But now, it felt like everything he had worked for was on the line. The thought of losing the farm, losing everything his family built, was a constant ache in his chest. He spent his mornings, as he always had, tending to the animals, checking the fences, trying to keep his mind off the battle with the HOA. But it was hard. His hands trembled slightly as he fed the cows. The sight of the barn, the same barn his grandfather had worked in, brought him no comfort now. Everywhere he looked, he saw the land his family had fought to keep, the land that had sustained them through hard times. It felt as though something intangible was slipping away. The trees his grandfather had planted stood as silent sentinels, as if they too were waiting for the outcome. That afternoon, Thomas received a call from his neighbor, Earl. "I don't know if you've heard, but they've been coming after me too," Earl said, his voice strained. "They're trying to say my pond is a nuisance to their golf course. They've sent me legal papers, threatening everything from fines to lawsuits." Earl's words hit him hard. He wasn't alone in this fight, but it didn't make it easier. Thomas had always prided himself on his independence. He'd never wanted to get involved in politics or fight for what was rightfully his. But now, his fight was not just for his farm. It was for every neighbor who had been silenced by the HOA's manipulations. The emotional toll was more than just stress. It was the realization that he was not just defending land. He was defending an entire way of life. His thoughts turned to his children. He couldn't let them grow up in a world where the powerful could simply take what they wanted. He had to stand firm. It wasn't just about the farm. It was about teaching them a lesson that they could never learn in a classroom. Sometimes, standing up for what's right costs everything, but it's always worth it. The confrontation came sooner than Thomas expected. The HOA had scheduled a meeting to discuss the bus shelter, and Thomas knew this was his chance to expose them for what they were. He had all the evidence he needed: corruption, misrepresentation, and greed. But he wasn't going to make a scene. He didn't need to yell or shout. No, he would use the truth. The truth had a way of bringing the most powerful people to their knees. As he walked into the meeting room, the room full of HOA residents turned to stare. The once bustling community center fell silent. Thomas stood tall, his boots heavy against the floor, his demeanor calm but unwavering. He had come to deliver the truth, and nothing else. The board members, Kessler, Vaughn, and Weiss, were sitting at the front, looking smug and self-assured. They had the support of the crowd, the backing of the community, or so they thought. Kessler stood at the podium, ready to launch into his usual spiel about safety and community benefits. But this time, things were different. Thomas stood up from his seat in the back. His voice was steady, but every word cut through the air like a blade. "I'm Thomas Johnson," he said. "For the past 15 years, I've served as your senior zoning inspector. I'm here to tell you that the bus shelter you're so eager to build is illegal." The room went quiet. Kessler's face drained of color. Vaughn looked uncomfortable, her practiced smile now a tight grimace. Stanley Weiss, the HOA attorney, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. They hadn't anticipated this. "I've reviewed your documentation," Thomas continued, "and what I found is clear. The property boundaries were falsified. No permits were filed. And the construction you planned doesn't just violate county ordinances. It's a land grab." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "The HOA's president is a real estate developer, and the company you've awarded the contract to? It's owned by his brother. A clear conflict of interest." The room erupted in murmurs. People looked at Kessler with growing suspicion. For the first time, they saw him for who he truly was. Someone who had been manipulating them for his own gain. Thomas held up the official cease and desist order, a document that had the full weight of the county behind it. "This project is over," he declared. The crowd erupted into chaos. Parents, residents, and board members shouted questions, but Thomas remained calm. He had won, but he knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice had only begun. Thomas's victory at the meeting wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a stand for everyone who had been bullied by the HOA, for everyone who had been forced to accept corruption as a way of life. The people who had been too afraid to speak up now found a voice. They began reaching out to Thomas, sharing their own stories of how the HOA had overstepped its bounds, how it had bullied them, threatened them, and tried to take what was rightfully theirs. Thomas had become a symbol not just for his own family, but for the entire community. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a man who had stood up to the system, someone who had refused to let the powerful walk all over the little guy. His stand against the HOA made others realize that they too could fight back. The HOA had underestimated him, thinking he would back down. They had thought that their money, their influence, could buy them anything. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. Money and power mean nothing when you stand for what's right. Thomas became more than just a man fighting for his farm. He became a beacon of hope for others. People began to see that they had power too. The community started to come together, fueled by a shared belief that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, should be allowed to steal what was rightfully theirs. In the aftermath of the meeting, the HOA was thrown into disarray. Richard Kessler, Melissa Vaughn, and Stanley Weiss were all under investigation. The entire board was suspended pending a full investigation into their illegal activities. The county commissioners, who had been complicit in their actions, were forced to take action. The investigation revealed widespread corruption, and several board members faced criminal charges for fraud and misappropriation of funds. For Thomas, it wasn't just about winning. It was about restoring the faith in a system that had allowed the corrupt to thrive for so long. He had exposed the truth, and now the county was taking action. The board's reign of terror was over. The lessons from this battle were clear. Corruption doesn't have to be accepted. The powerful can be challenged. And integrity, though it may seem like a rare commodity in today's world, is worth fighting for. The protagonist had learned that sometimes standing up for what's right means facing down the most formidable of foes. But in the end, integrity always prevails. With the HOA disbanded, the new leadership promised transparency. The roads would be improved with proper permits and at fair prices. The land was safe, his land was safe. And as he drove past that bus stop, now properly built on HOA property, he couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for the whole community. His grandfather would have been proud.